Yeah, we might be live here. All right, looks like we're live. All right, well, welcome everybody. Welcome. My name is Donna, Imam, and I do this live stream every Thursday, 7 p.m. Central Time. I'm a U.S. congressional candidate running in the brand new district that Austin, Texas got, Texas's 37th district. So I want to welcome you. And today we will be talking about voting rights. And so the goal of today is to give you, how did we get to this point where we're talking about voting rights in a way like it's an existential problem for us to solve? How do we get here? And then I will give you a three-pronged approach to solving for voting rights and getting voting rights here in our country so that everybody can vote without any problems whatsoever. So that is the agenda for today. We'll be focused fully on voting rights because I know that's on your mind. I will also give you a campaign update towards the end, a little bit of a campaign update to tell you what's going on. Of course, we have a primary here in Texas, which is coming up in like 3 weeks. You know, Valentine's Day, February 14th is when early voting starts. Pretty much everybody votes during early voting, and it's all over on March 1st. And the most important decisions in a campaign are made during the primary. So this is going to be one of the most important elections in terms of figuring out who your representatives are going to be. And of course, the majority of people in our country are unaware of primary elections because they're just not advertised and talked about very much in the media. They're very much a quiet affair, primarily because, incumbents have the upper hand and people in Congress really don't want people to come out and vote against them. So, bottom line is primary elections are not very talked about in most states. Definitely Texas is one of them. So let's get to what happened with voting rights. So yesterday we saw, let's go here. We saw that Senate Democrats failed to change rules on the filibuster to pass voting rights. So the idea here was to try to pass some sort of legislation to get 50 votes to change the Senate rules to move forward with legislation with a simple majority. And of course, we have two senators, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, who voted against this, and the rules change did not pass. And so, Democrats are naturally blaming those two senators for the failure to, basically do a rules change or a carve out for voting rights legislation. But the question is, how did we get here, and what do we do now that the filibuster rules change on filibuster didn't pass? So we heard the president and the vice president say, hey, we're not going to give up. What does that mean? We're not going to give up. Well, this impacts many states, of course, because after the 2020 election, many of these states with GOP trifecta control have passed legislation to make it more difficult to vote for certain people. And of course, the GOP doesn't admit that, but this impacts Texas in a very, very big way, like some of those other states. So let's talk about how it impacts Texas. How did we get here? And then, like I said, I have a three-pronged approach to solve for voting rights. First of all, right now in Texas, in 2021, they passed what's called Senate Bill 1. And Senate Bill 1, here's what it did. It reduced the amount of early voting time that people across the state could vote, because Harris County had allowed 24-hour voting, and the reason behind that was to allow people who are on hourly jobs that work 2 shifts, 3 shifts in a row to be able to vote around the clock and make it easier for them to not have to stand in line. So those were restricted. That is no longer allowed, number one. Number two, drive-through voting was instituted during, the rise of coronavirus in 2020. And of course, it almost feels like we're back in that spot right now. And that was stopped from happening in Texas. But here's the most interesting thing. In Texas, if you are 65 or older, you can vote by mail. No questions asked, okay? That is not allowed for anybody else. Now, there are some other, exceptions, like if you have a disability that you can prove, then you can vote by mail. If you're going to be out of town, out of state for the entire early voting period as well as the election day, then you can ask for a ballot to vote by mail. But other than that, you cannot vote by mail unless you're 65 or older. So naturally, at the beginning of the year, you have to apply in Texas to vote by mail because there is no electronic or automated voter registration or to get your ballot by mail. So every year, you have to download an application, you have to fill it out, and you have to mail it into the Secretary of State or to your local county and say, I would like a mail-in ballot. And this is for people who are 65 and over. It is completely guaranteed. But during the time that they passed Senate Bill 1, here's what they did. They said, when you apply for your mail-in ballot, you have to remember what you used as your ID number when you register to vote. So if you use the last four of your social security, if you use your social security number to sign up to vote, you will have to use those last four digits and they must match. If you use your driver's license, you must use that and those numbers must match. Now, imagine if you registered to vote a year ago. Do you remember if you used your social security number or your driver's license number? Probably not. And imagine if you registered to vote 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Most people have absolutely no recollection. So what they're doing is they're filing and they're putting one of the two on there. And of course, about hundreds of these ballots, could be a large percentage. I've heard up to 50% in certain counties are being rejected because people don't remember whether they use their driver's license or their social security number. Now, you might be thinking, that's ridiculous. That's really happening in Texas? The answer is yes. And guess what? This was brought up over and over again to the GOP legislator, the trifecta that they have. This was going to be an issue for a majority of people because they're not going to remember. And the answer was, oh, you'll be able to cure it. So now we're going through this huge process of applications being rejected, and then you have to go in and try to fix your application to be able to get it. It's a big, huge mess. So Texas is one of the hardest states to vote in. And during 2021, there were major things done to make it more difficult to vote. Number one, I also already cited, the number of hours that you can vote have been decreased as a whole. Number two, in order to vote by mail, now it has been made more difficult because you have to have this ID number matching, which is not happening. And we see right here, hundreds of mail-in ballot applications are being rejected. And number three, it is much more difficult for you to help someone to vote. So people who need help to vote are usually people where English is a second language or they don't speak English at all, for example. So they need someone to sometimes explain the ballot to them. It could be someone who's elderly, who has difficulty reading, who has difficulty understanding some of the things on the ballot. And a lot of times, ballots sound very simple. There's names on there and you pick the one you like. But however, in 2021, Texas had constitutional amendments, 10 constitutional amendments. These amendments were difficult to understand in the way they were written. In fact, I had to take time and read through all the amendments myself to try to really understand what they were trying to do. So these are not simple measures to be able to vote. So I can totally understand somebody whose English is a second language or they don't speak English, how much difficult it would be for them to vote unless someone explained it to them. That has been made a much more difficult process now because if you're helping someone to vote, you have to take all kinds of oath and face criminal penalties if you violate any of those oaths. And again, all of this has been done in Senate Bill 1 in Texas. Why do I tell you all of this? Because this is by design. The GOP has been working on this for decades. This did not happen overnight. And let me give you an example of what exactly happened. So a lot of people look at Texas and they say, Texas is a red state. It's never going to go blue. But if you go to Ballotopedia, you'll find that Democrats used to have a trifecta control of Texas, believe it or not, in the early 90s. They controlled the governor's position. They controlled the Senate and the House. And during these early 90s, the GOP, led by Tom DeLay, strategize on how to take back Texas from the Democrats. And you can see here in this diagram, they first went after the governor's seat. They won that. Then they started going after the Senate seats. They won that. And then they started going over the House seats. And then they won that. And now they've had a trifecta since the early 2000s. They control all three legislative aspects of Texas, giving them a trifecta, giving them the ability to pass any kind of law that they want. But you can see here that this did not happen overnight. This happened over the last 2 decades that they've been strategizing. And that is the difference between the GOP and the Democratic Party. So how do you solve for this? For years and years and years, the GOP has been gerrymandering states by design, and now partisan gerrymandering has been completely legalized by the Supreme Court. And it's been done that way because the Supreme Court has been strategically, set up to be conservative, because the GOP for decades has been funneling conservative lawyers and judges into that process. So lawyers at every federal level, judges at every federal level, including the Supreme Court, have become much more conservative. And they've incentivized them that, hey, if you want a judgeship at the federal level, you have to be a conservative, and this is how we're going to get you in. So they've incentivized them, they've got them in, because they knew that all of this would be fought out in the courts. So they've also strategized to ensure that if you do go to fight this in the courts, they will have judges that are sympathetic to partisan gerrymandering. So if a party has been working for decades trying to figure out how they hold on to power, and they hold on to power at any cost, do you think they're going to collaborate with you to allow you to have easy access to the ballot? Absolutely not, because right now they're getting elected into office with this system that they've put in place, and it's working for them. What is the one thing that elected officials most worry about? Being voted out. So what can we do to solve this problem? The problem doesn't just end at the legislative level, or that ballots are being thrown out, or even that we can't get a carve out in the filibuster. The problem is much more local. This is a photograph of people who are standing in line, and this is very common in various parts of the country. Every single time we have an election, especially a presidential election, what we see on the news is long lines at certain areas. Specifically, we see this in areas that are maybe have a lot of working Americans, a lot of people who are low-wage Americans, and in neighborhoods where people are low income seem to have less ability to be able to go vote, and they are forced to stand in line for a long time. Now imagine this. If you have a salary job, you often can tell your manager, hey, I'm going out to vote. I'm going to be out for a couple of hours, and then I'll be back, and you can make up the time and you can work from home, etc. But if you work on an hourly shift, let's say you're a nurse, or you do any kind of retail work whatsoever, you have set hours. Maybe you get 30 minutes for lunch, maybe you get 45 minutes break, but you do not get a break of 5 or 6 hours. So you go to vote, you're in line, for 30 minutes, and you're like, it's going to take me 5 hours. I got to go back to work. So this is how they have constructed a way to ensure that you are prevented from voting. They're not violating any big laws, but they're making it difficult for you to vote by forcing you to stand in line for hours. Now, you may be asking, why does that happen? The number of polling locations in a county and the number of voting machines in each of these polling locations is often determined at the very local level. So this is happening at a county level. In majority of cases, specifically in Texas, and I'm talking about Texas because I know a lot about Texas, but in other states as well, you'll find that these determinations are being made mostly at the county level in terms of how many polling places. Now imagine this. If you have a high density population in an area of town and a low density population in another area of town, then logically speaking, you should have a different set or number of polling locations in areas that are high density, right? That makes total sense. But these are also ways that they are restricting people to not be able to vote, not just by lowering the number of hours or by making it difficult to vote by mail, which if you're under 65 in Texas, you cannot unless you have a special provision. So that in itself is extremely discriminatory towards people who are under 65. Straight up saying, Age discrimination. You're under 65, you cannot vote by mail. You're over 65, you can vote by mail. So in my three-pronged solution, number one, yes, we need a federal solution. There's no doubt about that, to level the playing field. This is not about getting into states' rights, but by saying, hey, we need to do certain things so people don't have to stand in line for hours based on what kind of area that they live in or work in, right? If you live in an area that people are not having to wait at all, like they're only waiting 10 minutes or 15 minutes to vote, then every other area should have that kind of equal ability to do the same, right? So we need a system at the federal level that levels the playing field and ensures that voters have the ability to take time off so they can vote. It doesn't make sense to give people long early voting hours as well as election day if they have to work every single day. And let me give you an example. When the John Deere union employees were protesting and on strike, one of the things that they were striking about were these really unimaginable work hours where they were being forced to work back-to-back shifts 7 days in a row without any kind of breaks. So if you're working back-to-back shifts 7 days in a row, how do you even get time to go vote? You have no ability to take time off to vote. You're essentially being told you cannot vote because you have to work just to keep your job. You see where I'm going with this? So first of all, we have to level the playing field and we have to give everybody the ability to go out and vote. Number two, we need to expand early voting and vote by mail so that it's not discriminatory. Specifically, we have right now in Texas straight up age discrimination against people who cannot vote by mail. And we've seen states across this country, more than one, that allow vote by mail for 100% of the voters. And we see absolutely no evidence of voter fraud. So that's number one. Number two, if it is actually true, for example, that if you vote by mail, there's more chance of voter fraud, which by the way, there's no evidence for, then why would you allow one segment of the population to do it while you don't allow the other segment? It doesn't make any logical sense whatsoever. So we need that kind of baseline for expanding early voting and vote by mail. And we need to allocate polling locations and voting machines based on population density so that wait times are not prohibitive to voting. These are the baseline things we need at the federal level. And we have to start with things that we can bring everybody on board for. But we know that accomplishing these things at the federal level is going to be very difficult. So solution number two is really focusing on local level politics. Now we know that the GOP for a long time, and I showed you with an example in Texas, how they went after the governor's seat in Texas in the early 90s, and they got that. Then they went after the Senate, and they got a majority in the Texas State Senate. Then they went after the House, and they gerrymandered to get a majority in the Texas State Senate. Now the GOP is going after even local races. They're going after mayoral races, city council races, and school board races, which in most cases, even in Austin, Texas, for example, city council races and school board races are not supposed to be partisan. They're not supposed to be partisan. But guess what? Everybody runs on a partisan platform, and Democratic clubs and Republican clubs, they endorse these candidates, making it a partisan election. So what the GOP has already figured out is winning these local elections are very, very easy because so few people come out to vote. There's so little media covering those races. Often it might get a mention in the local news, like the day before or the day of voting. But other than that, the majority of the people are not tuned in. They have no idea that there's a school board race going on unless it's on the same ballot with major statewide races or presidential races. So what the GOP has figured out is these races cover very small parts of a region, right? Cities, some of the cities are very tiny. And so you can win these local races with a very small budget. So that's what they're doing. They're focusing on local races. And remember, I mentioned to you that many of these solutions that I talked about with respect to right now polling locations and the hours they can vote, the number of machines, these are determined at the local level. So solution number 2 is, if you are one of those people that live in an area that has a 6-hour, 7-hour, 8-hour vote where you're having to stand in line, the biggest way to solve this is to solve it at the local level unless you get some sort of federal assistance. And right now, since there's no path to a federal leveling of the playing field when it comes to voting rights, we have to focus on local races. That is solution number 2. If we can flip city council races, school board races, county commissioners races, people who are making these, decisions at the county level, we have to get involved. If we don't have enough voting machines or polling locations, that's where we need to figure out who at the county level is making those decisions. We have to make sure that we bring it up to them. And if they're elected officials, we have to vote them out. So that is solution number 2. And all of these solutions sound really hard and like a long path. And you're like, we want the easy path. We want a federal solution. We want it now. Remember, the GOP spent decades. They spent decades strategizing and going down one by one and ensuring that they have power, and now they're going to hold on to it. Now they're coming after local races, but it is extremely important that if we want our voting rights, we have to get involved at the local level, and we have to start winning those races, and we have to implement voting rights to ensure that we have the right number of ballot boxes or voting machines and polling locations, etc., etc. And then, of course, it goes up to the state level and so on and so forth. But bottom line is, this is not going to be an easy fix. It's something that we're going to have to work on. And as I say always, our government is a reflection of ourselves. So that is also a very important part. The third thing that Democrats talk a lot about is messaging. And one of the things that you'll find Democratic strategists talk a lot about is Democrats do a poor job of messaging. They have a great message, but they do a poor job of communicating that. So let's talk about the message, right? When Democrats have a trifecta in Washington, right now they have a majority in the House of Representatives. They have a very slim one-person majority, which is the VP vote in the Senate. But they also have the White House. So technically, Democrats have a trifecta in Washington, D.C. right now. And during this time, what have they delivered for the American people? The message that they ran on was childcare, universal pre-K, Medicare expansion to include dental and vision and hearing, and lowering the prescription drug prices, climate mitigation, paid leave, tuition-free community college, and a pathway to citizenship for DACA and TPS. But before the Build Back Better bill ever got out of the House, all these things that you see in red were gutted. They were gutted in the House before they even got to the Senate. And that is the most important part, that when you run on this platform and then you put it in front of the American people and then you take it away and you say, you know what, we're not going to be able to give you dental or vision, even though we said we would. Okay, we're not going to be able to lower the prescription drug prices. We're only going to do it for 10 drugs. It sounds kind of ridiculous at that point, right? We can't give you paid leave, even though every other modern, country in the world has paid leave. We're not going to give you tuition-free community college. Instead, we're going to load you up with mortgage-sized student loan debt for the rest of your life. So you can't start a family, so you can't put a down payment on that home and live out your American dream. And even though we promised you for decades that we're going to give you a path to citizenship, we are unable to make that happen. And this is before it even got in the Senate. So it's not so much about what you've messaged because you have brought this to the American people, but it's also about not being able to deliver on your message and having a strategy to deliver on your message. The reason that Democrats today are struggling to get their message across is because they are not delivering on the message that they've been saying that we are going to do for decades and decades. $15 an hour minimum wage has been a stable part of the Democratic platform, yet we're unable to get anywhere close to that. We're still at $7.25, right? For federal wages, for example, which is a ridiculous wage. You can't even live on $15 an hour in large cities. So bottom line is, we have to deliver on policy that impact specifically working Americans, the bottom 50% of our country, which right now it looks like Democrats are unable to do. Number one. And number two, we need to win local races, and we need to be strategic about winning them with a strong economic solution and then enacting on it and delivering it. And number three, we need to ensure that we have federal leveling the playing field voting rights legislation, which seems extremely difficult to do. But those are the three-pronged approach that we are going to have to take if we want to get voting rights. It's not going to come just because we want it, and it's not going to come in a short amount of time, because obviously we have senators that are putting up a lot of resistance to just passing bills as is. So there's a lot of work to be done, but here's the good news. The good news is very simple. It took the GOP decades to get to this point where they're using their power to enact laws that are completely ridiculous, for example, and making it more difficult to vote. But it took them decades. And even though it looks very bleak right now, if we start working towards getting these three-pronged approach in place, we can also get it done, and we can get it done quicker if we're strategic about it. So it can be done, and that is the way to get voting rights. It's not a simple, easy answer, but it is definitely, there is a path to get voting rights across this country if we all work together. So with that, I want to conclude today with a little update on our race. So as I mentioned, Texas has primary voting on March 1st. It's one of the earlier states to have primary voting. Right now, Texas is so gerrymandered. In 2021, the trifecta in the Texas legislature passed laws to further gerrymander our state. So Texas, because of population growth, got 2 new districts in addition to the 36 that they already have. Now, the reason they got that is because 95% of the population growth in Texas happen to be of Hispanic and Black Americans and Asian Americans. Because of this growth, Texas got 2 new districts. Now, when Texas got 2 new districts, the conventional wisdom would be both of them would be gerrymandered to be red. But in order to save all their incumbent GOP members, what Texas did is they further gerrymandered the red districts in Texas, basically appended them with more rural areas, making them extremely, extremely red in order to prevent them from flipping blue in the entire next decade. So you see what they're doing? They're like, hey, we have X number of US congressional seats that are red. We're going to make them redder so that we can hold on to our power for the entire next decade. They did that at the state representative level. They did that at the state Senate level. And they did that at the U.S. congressional level, even though they got 2 new U.S. congressional districts. And out of those 2, instead of making them both red, they created a sync district right here in Austin, Texas, which is heavily blue or Democratic leaning, where they packed in all the Democrats in order to make the 6 districts that used to run through Austin even more red. They made all of them as red as possible, and they created a sync district in the middle. Out of the 6 districts, only one of them was blue leaning, and the other 5 were extremely red. So they made them even redder, and then created this brand new district, which is Texas's 37th district. And I am running in Texas's 37th district. I've been redistricted into this district. This is the district that I have been living in for over 15 years. It's where I, grew my career at some of the most iconic companies here in Austin, Texas. And now I am on the ballot. We have thousands of donors, grassroots donors to our campaign. As you know, in 2020, I ran for Congress in North Austin prior to redistricting. We got the highest Democratic voter turnout in the history of the district. We got the highest voter turnout in the history of the district. And Williamson County, all of which was in my district, was number 1 in voter turnout in all of Texas among the top 25 most populated counties. And we did that by taking our strong economic message to the doors of voters. And this is what our campaign is all about. We want to do that all over again. And that's what we've embarked on. Right now, we are trying to reach voters and get our message to them to say, Austin, you have been redistricted. You have a brand new district. This is an opportunity to send a new representative that will champion single payer healthcare, Medicare for all, but not just champion that to lower the cost of healthcare, but also improve the quality of care by scaling the healthcare infrastructure with more nurses, doctors, providers. Why? Because Texas has the most number of people with no health insurance. Texas is also number one in the most number of rural hospital closures. We absolutely need healthcare coverage for Texans. This is an opportunity for Austin to send a new representative to champion student loan elimination and debt-free education, whether that means 2-year community college, 4-year college, graduate school, or even trades and certifications. It's a unique opportunity to send someone who got out the vote. And because we're so gerrymandered that we will not be able to flip a single seat probably across all of Texas, because each one of them are gerrymandered in a way either to go left or right, blue or red. Our way to take back Texas is simple. We have to get out every single Democrat to vote and flip statewide races. In 2018, Beto O'Rourke was short just 215,000 votes. Austin, Texas, by my calculations, and its suburbs, can deliver up to 100,000 more Democratic votes to close that gap. Now, if we bring the other blue cities across Texas together, El Paso and San Antonio, parts of Dallas-Fort Worth, and parts of Houston, we can help flip statewide seats. Remember, I showed you a little while ago how the GOP in Texas first took over the governor's seat, then they took over the Senate seats, then they took over the state rep seats. We have that opportunity. The only way we take back Texas is by flipping statewide seats, and we can do that if we get out every Democratic vote. And how do we do that? We take a strong economic message that solves the very problems that working families are facing, not just in Texas, but across this country. We're talking about healthcare, education, being able to save to put a down payment on a home so you can retire someday. These are simple messages that not only can we take to voters, but we can enact them easily and in a very financially effective way. So that's what our campaign is doing. That is what our solutions are. So if you are watching this and you can help out, please consider donating to our campaign at votefordonna.com. That's vote, FORDONNA.com, or join our campaign and volunteer and help us get out the vote. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of the Thursday